Sometimes, the most dangerous question isn't about money, power, or success. It's about who's left when everything else is gone. Richard Lawson had it all, a financial empire built from scratch. His name splashed across magazine covers, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, watches that cost more than cars, meetings where a single word from him could move millions. But when the phone rang, it was never to ask how he was doing, just numbers, contracts, crises that had to be solved before the market opened. When the silence came, and it always came, there was no one on the other end. His kids didn't call. The friends he once had got lost somewhere between the 10th and 20th canceled meeting. The people around him existed, but none of them actually stayed. They were there for what he could offer, for the last name, for the access, for the influence, but never for him. So, on a cold October afternoon, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He stopped. He turned off his phone, left the office without telling anyone, and walked to a park on the Upper West Side, where he sat alone on a wooden bench worn down by time. It was there, surrounded by strangers rushing past, that he realized the hardest truth of all. He had built an empire, but forgotten to build a life. And it was there, on that empty bench, that an unknown woman sat down beside him, looked at him with a devastating calm, and asked the question no one had ever dared to ask, "Don't you have anyone anymore?" The crack in the glass started small, but it was enough for everything to come crashing down, and maybe for something new to finally begin. Sometimes the most dangerous question isn't about money, power, or success. It's about who's left when everything else is gone. The park sat on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, one of those green refuges squeezed between glass and steel skyscrapers reflecting the October sunset. It was an ordinary weekday, and autumn painted everything in shades of orange and gold. Dry leaves crunched under the hurried steps of executives, moms pushing strollers, bike couriers, people passing by without looking around, all trapped in their own urgencies. In the middle of that constant flow, there was a wooden bench worn down by time and seasons, and on it, sitting alone, was a man who didn't quite belong in the scene. He wore a discreet Italian suit, but any trained eye would recognize the impeccable cut, the fabric that cost more than an entire monthly paycheck. The watch on his wrist was slim, with no visible brand, exactly the kind billionaires wear when they don't want attention. His hair was neatly gray, his posture straight, but his shoulders slightly slumped, as if carrying an invisible weight. At 53, Richard Lawson was a familiar name in New York's financial circles. His face appeared now and then in the Wall Street Journal, next to headlines about billion-dollar mergers and strategic investments. He had built an empire from nothing, or at least that's what people said. The truth was more uncomfortable. He built an empire on top of nothing, stacking bricks of ambition where roots should have been planted. Now, sitting on that bench, with his phone vibrating insistently in the inside pocket of his blazer, he stared at the artificial lake in front of him. Ducks glided across the dark water. Kids ran after kites. Couples walked hand in hand. And he was alone. It wasn't the temporary loneliness of someone waiting for another person. It was chronic loneliness, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of your structure. He pulled out his phone. 32 notifications, all work-related. Reports, automated emails, meeting reminders. Not a single personal message. No, "Hey, how are you?" No, "Miss you." Just numbers, contracts, alerts. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The wound was silent but deep. No one called just to see if he was okay. He tried to remember the last time someone asked how he actually felt. He couldn't place it. Maybe years ago. Maybe never. People around him asked about strategies, projections, market scenarios, but never about him. The bench beside him was empty. It always had been. It had become a symbol without him noticing, the worn wooden seat, wide enough for two people, occupied by only one. It was his whole life, full of space, empty of presence. He let out a deep breath, feeling the cold October air fill his lungs. The sun slowly sank behind the buildings, painting the sky pink and lavender. Soon, the park would empty out. City lights would turn on, and he would go back home, to a 4,000-square-foot penthouse overlooking Central Park, where the most common sound was the echo of his own footsteps. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to remember the last time he felt real human warmth, not the formal handshake of a negotiation, not the polite hug at charity events, but the kind of contact that expects nothing in return, that exists just because it does. He couldn't remember. He opened his eyes again. The park was still there, indifferent. Life moved around him, fast and loud, while he remained still, like a stone in the middle of a river. And then, without warning, someone sat down beside him. She sat without asking permission. Richard didn't notice right away. He was so absorbed in his own thoughts that her presence arrived like a whisper, soft but impossible to ignore. He turned his head and saw her, a black woman in her early 40s, curly hair pulled into a loose bun, faded jeans, a gray hoodie worn at the cuffs. In her arms, a brown paper bag filled with pieces of bread. She didn't look back at him. She simply opened the bag, took a piece of bread, and carefully crumbled it, tossing the crumbs to pigeons that gathered within seconds, cooing and fighting for space on the stone ground. Richard froze. He didn't know whether he should say something, get up, or just sit there pretending he was still alone. The physical closeness of another person, without an agenda, without formality, without an obvious reason, felt strange to him, almost uncomfortable, but she seemed completely at ease. The pigeons multiplied. She smiled softly, tossing more crumbs. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile. It was the kind of silence that exists between strangers sharing a public space, neither intimate nor distant, just there. Richard looked forward again, trying to sink back into the comfortable emptiness from before, but he couldn't. Her presence changed everything. The bench was no longer just his. The park was no longer just a backdrop. There was someone beside him, and that was enough to disrupt the fragile balance he had built. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe 10. Time moved differently in the park, and then, without warning, she turned her face toward him. Her eyes were dark, direct, but not intrusive. There was genuine curiosity there, mixed with something that felt like compassion, or maybe just recognition, as if she had seen something in him that he didn't even know he was showing. And she asked, in a calm, almost gentle voice, "Don't you have anyone anymore?" The question landed like a crack in the thick glass Richard had built over a lifetime. He blinked, caught off guard, opened his mouth, but no words came out. It wasn't anger he felt, or offense. It was something worse. Exposed truth. How did she know? How did this woman, who had never seen him before, who had no idea who he was, manage to see in seconds what he had hidden from himself for years? He tried to smile. A social smile, automatic, the kind he used at business dinners when someone asked an inconvenient question, but it didn't come. His facial muscles simply refused. She kept looking at him, patient. She didn't seem to be demanding an answer. She had just asked the question, and now she waited, without hurry, without judgment. Richard looked away, at the pigeons, the lake, the trees. Anything but her eyes. He started, but his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. I have people. It sounded fake even to him. She nodded slowly, like someone who understood exactly what hadn't been said. People who call you? She asked, without malice. Or people who work for you? Richard felt his chest tighten. The distinction was cruel, but precise. He had hundreds of contacts, dozens of employees, partners, consultants, lawyers, people who depended on him, who replied to emails within minutes, who were always available. But no one called. No one asked if he was okay. No one showed up for no reason. No one shared silence just because. He swallowed hard. I'm not sure I understand the difference, he lied. She smiled softly, but it wasn't a victorious smile. It was sad, understanding. I think you do, she said, turning her gaze back to the pigeons. Richard stayed silent. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if he were trying to hold back something threatening to spill out. Anger? Sadness? Shame? Maybe all of it together. Her question echoed in his head, relentless. Don't you have anyone anymore? And the answer he had never dared to say out loud screamed inside him. No, I don't have anyone. She tossed another handful of crumbs. The pigeons fought over them, wings flapping. Life moved on around them, indifferent to the open wound between two strangers on a park bench. But something had changed. The glass had cracked, and now, for the first time in years, Richard didn't know if he wanted to fix it or let it finally shatter. They sat in silence for a few more minutes. It wasn't the strange silence from before. It was different now, lighter, shared, as if her question had opened a door, and neither of them was in a hurry to walk through it. Richard took a deep breath. The cold October air filled his lungs and brought a bit of clarity. He glanced sideways at her, still feeding the pigeons with the patience of someone who did it every day. "Do you come here often?" he asked, breaking the silence with a voice that still sounded a little unused to conversations without a purpose. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the birds. "Every day, since my husband died." The answer came so simply, so directly, that Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what to say. Sorry felt empty. Questions felt intrusive. So he stayed quiet, and she went on. 2 years ago, heart attack. It was fast. She paused, tossed more crumbs. Sometimes I still expect him to come home at the end of the day. It's stupid, I know. But the heart takes longer than the head to understand. Richard looked down at his own hands. Hands that had signed million-dollar contracts. Hands that had never held on to anyone long enough. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in a long while he felt the words were real. She shrugged, but not indifferently. It was the gesture of someone who had learned how to carry pain without letting it weigh too much. "Life goes on, right? I have 2 daughters. I work at a cafe on 3rd Avenue. I wake up every day, do what needs to be done, but I come here before going home." She finally looked at him again. The quiet of the park helps put the pain in order. Richard nodded slowly. He understood that in a way he hadn't expected to. Silence was the only place where he could really breathe too, away from phone calls, meetings, decisions that weighed tons. "And you?" she asked with a gentle curiosity. "Why are you here?" He hesitated. How could he explain? How could he say he was running from a life he'd built with his own hands, but that now felt like a golden cage? "I don't know," he admitted. "I think I just needed to stop." She smiled softly. "Stopping is good. We forget that." Richard looked around. The park was emptier now. The sun was dropping fast, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the ground. The cold was getting sharper, but he didn't feel like leaving. "Do you have kids?" she asked, breaking the silence again. The question hurt more than it should have. "I have 2, he replied, his voice lower. "A boy and a girl. Grown now. Are you close?" Richard took a deep breath. "No, we're not." She didn't push. She just nodded, like someone who understands that some distances aren't measured in miles. "It's hard, right? Building bridges, keeping them standing." "Yeah," he agreed, surprised by how easily the confession came. "I don't think I ever learned. I was always better at building other things." "Buildings? Companies? Walls," he corrected with a bitter smile. She let out a quiet laugh, but not a cruel one. It was the kind of laugh that recognizes the truth without judging it. "At least you know." They fell silent again, but now it was different. There was something comforting there, as if they were sharing a weight that felt lighter once divided. Richard looked at the bench beside her. It wasn't empty anymore. There was someone there. "What's your name?" he asked. "Diane," she replied. "And yours?" "Richard." "Nice to meet you, Richard. The pleasure's mine." And it was true. For the first time in years he felt something like pleasure in a conversation. There were no ulterior motives. Nothing to gain. It was just human. Diane folded the empty bag and placed it on her lap. "Are you coming here tomorrow?" she asked. Richard blinked, surprised by the question, and even more surprised by the answer that came out of his own mouth. "I think so." She smiled. "Then I'll see you." And without another word, she stood up, gave a small wave, and walked down the stone path, disappearing among the trees. Richard stayed there, alone again, but the bench didn't feel so empty anymore. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear between the clouds, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel just loneliness. He felt hope. Richard came back the next day. He didn't plan it, didn't write it down in his calendar. He simply left the office at 4 p.m, ignored the driver waiting in front of the building, and walked the 6 blocks to the park. Diane was already there on the same bench with the same bag of bread. When she saw him, she smiled like someone greeting an old friend. "You came," she said, not surprised. "I said I would," he replied, sitting down beside her. "You did, but most people don't do what they say." Richard didn't answer. He just watched the pigeons already gathering, waiting for the crumbs. They talked about small things, about how the cold was coming earlier that year, about how the park felt different after 4 in the afternoon, when the shadows grew longer and the crowds thinned out, about the cafe where Diane served coffee every day to rushed executives who barely looked at her. "Some people order the same coffee for months and never ask my name," she said. "I'm there every day, but I'm invisible." Richard swallowed hard. He was exactly that kind of person. How many times had he passed by someone without really seeing them? "I get it," he said softly. "You do? I'm invisible too, just in a different way." Diane turned toward him, curious. "What do you mean?" Richard hesitated. The words were stuck in his throat, heavy as stones. But something about that bench, that cold afternoon, that simple and unguarded presence of Diane, made him want to speak, need to speak. "People see me," he began slowly. "But they don't see me. They see the money, the position, the last name, what I can do for them." Diane nodded but didn't say anything. She just waited. "I have 2 kids," Richard continued, his voice lower now. "A boy and a girl. James is 31. Sarah is 28. They haven't spoken to me in almost 3 years. Why?" Richard took a deep breath. The question was simple, but the answer was an abyss. "Because I wasn't there. I never was. When they were little, I was building the company. When they were teenagers, I was expanding it. When they became adults, it was already too late. They don't really know me. And I don't know them." Diane stayed quiet for a moment, processing. "Did you try?" "I did," he admitted. "I called, sent messages, apologized, but apologies don't erase years of absence. They told me they didn't need a father now, that I had my chance, and didn't take it." The words came out with difficulty, like they'd been lodged inside him for years. "And friends?" Diane asked gently. Richard gave a bitter smile. "Friends? I have partners, business associates, people who invite me to dinners because I'm useful. But real friends?" He shook his head. "I don't know if I ever had any. And the ones I did have, I pushed away, prioritized meetings, canceled lunches. There was always something more important." Diane studied his face. There was pain there. Old pain, accumulated, carried alone. "And now you have a huge house and no one to share it with," she said, without cruelty, just stating a fact. "Exactly," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. "I built all of this, but I never learned how to stay. I never learned how to be present. I thought success was enough. That money was enough. That being respected was enough." He stopped, looked at his hands again. "But it isn't. None of it means anything when you go home, and the only sound you hear is the echo of your own footsteps." Diane stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she said something simple, almost childlike. But it hit Richard like lightning. "There's still time to learn." He looked at her, incredulous. "Learn? I'm 53 years old, Diane. I lost my kids. I lost everyone. How is there still time?" She smiled, but it was a sad smile full of experience. "Because you're still here. Because you're still feeling. Because you came here today, even though you didn't have to." She paused. "Learning how to stay doesn't have an age. It just takes willingness." Richard felt his eyes burn. He hadn't cried in years, decades maybe, but there, on that bench, with that woman he barely knew, he felt something break inside him. They weren't tears yet, but they were cracks. The symbol was changing. The bench no longer held 2 solitary weights. It held 2 stories that were finally touching. They met in the park for the next 5 days, always at the same time, always on the same bench. Diane brought bread for the pigeons. Richard brought only himself, and little by little, that began to feel like enough. They talked about everything and nothing. She told stories about her daughters, about silly arguments at home, about plans for the future. He listened with an attention he had never given in board meetings. Sometimes he talked about the past, about regrets, about bridges he burned without realizing it. And for the first time in decades, Richard wasn't building anything. He was just being. But on the 6th day, the old world came to pull him back. It was 4:15 in the afternoon when the phone rang. Richard looked at the screen. It was Martin, the company's vice president. He hesitated, then answered. "Richard, thank God. Where are you?" Martin's voice was tense, almost desperate. "I'm dealing with something. We need you here, now." Heathrow Holdings backed out of the merger. They want an emergency meeting in an hour, or the deal is dead. That's $200 million on the line, Richard. 200 million. Richard felt the familiar weight tighten around his chest. The adrenaline, the urgency, the automatic reflex to drop everything and run to put out fires. I'm on my way, he answered, almost without thinking. He hung up and stood there, staring at the black screen. Diane was beside him, quiet. She didn't ask anything. She just waited. Richard rose slowly, slipping the phone into the inside pocket of his blazer. His body was already moving on autopilot. The steps, the straight posture, the professional mask sliding back onto his face. "I need to go," he said, not looking at her. "It's okay," Diane replied, with a calm that disarmed him. He took 2 steps toward the park exit, but something held him back. It wasn't physical. It was a voice inside him, low and insistent, asking, "And if you go right now, what actually changes?" Richard stopped, turned slowly, and looked at Diane. She was still sitting there, the bag of bread in her lap, watching the pigeons. "You're not going to ask what happened?" he asked, confused. She gave a small smile. "I don't need to. I know. There's always a meeting, always an emergency, always something more important." The words cut deep. Richard looked at the phone in his hand, thought about the conference room, the partners waiting, the 200 million, the contracts, the consequences, and then he thought about Diane, the bench, the simple conversation, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years. The phone buzzed again. Martin. Again. Richard looked at the screen and turned it off. Didn't answer. He just shut the phone down and, in a gesture that felt almost symbolic, set it to silent and shoved it deep into his pocket. He walked back to the bench and sat down again beside Diane. She looked at him, surprised, but she didn't say a word. "They're going to be furious," Richard said, his voice shaky. "They'll call me 20 times. They'll text. They'll say I've lost my mind." "And did you?" Diane asked, a playful spark in her eyes. Richard let out a short, nervous laugh. "Maybe. I don't know." He looked at the lake, at the ducks gliding across the water. "But for the first time in a long time, I don't want to be anywhere else." Diane smiled. A real one. Warm. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." Richard felt his chest tighten again, but this time it was different. Not anxiety. Relief. Like a weight he'd been carrying for decades had been lifted, even if only for a few minutes. They sat in silence. The sun kept dropping, staining everything orange and purple. The park emptied out little by little. The cold sharpened, but neither of them moved. For the first time in his life, Richard Lawson chose a person over a number, and the bench, that used to feel empty even when someone sat on it, finally felt full. The sun went down slowly, like it wanted to give everything time to settle. The park emptied out almost completely. City lights flicked on one by one, drawing artificial constellations between the buildings. The October cold grew harsher, but Richard and Diane stayed there, side by side, in a silence that didn't need filling. Diane opened the bread bag one last time. She took out a small piece, stared at it for a second, and then placed it on the bench, right between them. "What's that for?" Richard asked, curious. She smiled. "So you remember you can always share." Richard stared at the piece of bread. So simple, so insignificant, and somehow it carried a meaning he couldn't put into words. "I don't know if I can fix what I broke," he said quietly. "My kids, my friends, all of that's been behind me for a long time." Diane turned toward him. "Then don't fix it. Start over." "How?" "The way you did here. Showing up, staying, listening, being honest." She paused. "Nobody expects you to be perfect, Richard. They just want you to try." His eyes burned again. This time, he didn't fight it. A tear slid slowly down his face, and he wiped it with the back of his hand, almost embarrassed. "It's been so long since I've cried," he admitted. "Then it was about time," Diane said softly. They stayed there a few more minutes until the cold got too sharp to ignore. Diane stood up, adjusted her coat, and picked up the empty bag. "I have to go. My girls are waiting for me at home." Richard nodded, standing too. "Thank you, Diane, for everything." She smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Just don't disappear, okay?" "I won't," he promised. And this time he knew it was true. Diane gave a small wave and walked down the stone path, disappearing between the trees. Richard stayed a moment longer, alone but not lonely. There was a difference now, a difference he finally understood. He took out his phone. 53 notifications, furious emails, missed calls, messages in all caps. But in the middle of it all, there was one message from Sarah, his daughter. "Dad, Martin called me saying you disappeared. Are you okay?" Richard read it 3 times. It was short, formal, but it was there. She asked if he was okay. He typed slowly, deleted it, typed again. "Hi, Sarah. Sorry to worry you. I'm okay. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Can we talk sometime? No rush. Just talk." He hit send before his courage could run out. The reply took 2 minutes, but it came. "Okay, call me whenever." Richard smiled. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a guaranteed fresh start. But it was a door, and doors could be walked through. 3 weeks later, the bench in the park wasn't empty anymore. Richard came back almost every day. Sometimes he found Diane, sometimes he went alone, but now he brought bread too, fed the pigeons, talked to strangers, sat down and just stayed. He called James, his son. The conversation was hard, tense, full of long pauses, but it happened. And the next week, it happened again. Slowly, word by word, they started rebuilding something that had felt lost. Richard also started delegating more at work, left earlier, turned down meetings that weren't truly urgent, learned the difference between what mattered and what only looked like it did. And on a cold November afternoon, Sarah showed up at the park. She stopped a few yards away, watching her father on the bench, tossing crumbs to the birds. Richard saw her and stood up, his heart racing. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice uncertain. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, his voice catching. She walked closer and sat down on the bench. Richard sat beside her. They stayed quiet for a while, just watching the park. "You've changed," Sarah said. "I'm trying," he replied. She nodded. "I want to try, too." Richard felt his eyes burn again. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of hope. The bench, once a symbol of loneliness, was now a meeting place. And Richard, for the first time in decades, wasn't alone. If this story touched you, maybe it's a gentle reminder. Nobody is so rich they don't need someone, and nobody is so alone they don't deserve to be seen. Thank you for staying until the end.